I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. David Broderick. David, his talk this evening, or maybe I say story this evening, is about the Master of Portumna Workhouse, Corruption and Exploitation. David is a historian and researcher from County Tipperary who currently works at the Irish Workhouse Centre in Portumna in County Galway. David holds a master's degree in Public History and Cultural Heritage from the University of Limerick, and his book, Finding Ogle, The Mystery of the Disappearing Workhouse Master, published in 2019, is a study of the Portumna Workhouse in County Galway and its notorious master, Henry Ogle. If you'd be happy to start your talk, David.
Okay, Dolores, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And welcome everybody tonight, and special hello to Jared there. And I enjoyed his wonderful talk. He's a fountain of knowledge. Most of that stuff, the vast majority of that, just came from his head, and very impressive. And I'm honoured to be in such great company tonight. So what I might do is I might just stop my video just to back up the strength of my bandwidth here, if that's okay. So I should be gone there now. And yeah, so if there's any problems, Dolores, you just let me know as we go along, okay? So I'm going to begin my talk, or as Dolores said, my story about the Master of Portumna Workhouse, the infamous Henry Ogle, and the corruption and exploitation that he got up to. And again, I'm honoured to be speaking here tonight. So the workhouse, I'm not going to go to talk too much about the background of the workhouse, because Jared has done a great job in giving the background of the workhouse system. I'll just use one quote here, and it's from John O'Connor's book on the workhouses of Ireland. And O'Connor says that the workhouse was the most feared and hated institution ever established in Ireland. And after listening to the previous speaker, we can understand why. And hopefully after this talk as well, we'll understand even a little bit more as to why the workhouse has come down to us so negatively in tradition and folklore. We can see just an image here on the left-hand side, and it's from Peter Higginbottom's website, workhouses.org, and Peter Higginbottom has done wonderful research on the workhouses in both Ireland and the UK. And here we have Oliver Twist in the bottom right-hand side, in that famous pose where he asks for more in the film by Charles Dickens's book on Oliver Twist. So I suppose it must be said that, you know, to be treated badly in a workhouse in Ireland, you know, the paupers, in inverted commas, were treated badly, but that was also the case in England. And I have visited a couple of workhouses in England as well, and you know, treated quite bad in the UK as well. Some of the terms that come up when we research the workhouses, and the backdrop here are dormitories in Portumna Workhouse. You know, there was disease, there was cholera, smallpox, dysentery, typhus. Again, Jared mentioned that stigma. Stigma was a huge part of the workhouse. There's an old saying in Portumna, or an old story, that if you wanted to insult somebody in the pub while you were having a pint, you would say to him, be careful not to throw a stone over the wall of the workhouse. You might hit one of your own. It really was, you know, the kind of worst thing that could happen to somebody, or to be associated with the workhouse. There was punishment, there was neglect, there was starvation. People were fed, but slowly starving. The amount of calories that were taken in per day, it's often suggested that they were actually being slowly starved to death. There was segregation, as Jared touched on, and there was separation. Families were separated. There was cruelty, and again, malnutrition, hunger and cold. So on to the workhouse master. In 1840, the Poor Law Commissioner suggested non-commissioned army and constabulary officers would make the most suitable workhouse masters. His duties included keeping a register of all the paupers admitted, maintaining discipline, reading prayers to the paupers before breakfast and after supper, providing and enforcing the employment of the able-bodied paupers during the hours of labour, training the youth in keeping the partially disabled paupers occupied to the extent of their ability, and preventing idleness at all time, reporting regularly to the guardians, procuring provisions and work material, supplying the names of boys and girls suitable for permanent employment outside the workhouse, etc. or example, services and trades, notifying the medical officer of death and burying the paupers not removed by the family and sending them back to their electoral division. I'm sorry now, I'm just not seeing the very bottom of my lines of my slides, so sometimes I might have to leave out a short line. This is a quote from a poem in the Children's Folklore Collection, which is available online in Dukas, and again, a valuable source of local folklore and lots of references to the famine. This one is by James Turlin Billywood, and a couple of lines are pulled from it. Speaking about the master, he says, "He separates them and they must away. They hear his threats and trembling they obey. Without remorse his galing whip he yields. He wields oppression triumphs and compassion yields." So there's a lot of, as I mentioned, kind of negativity surrounding these workhouse masters, and we go back to where they're looking for constabulary or ex-military men to take up these roles, and oftentimes these men were actually expelled from, you know, the army or the police force for being too heavy-handed, and these were the kind of guys that were taking over these roles in the workhouses. Because don't forget, as Jared mentioned, some of the workhouses could hold 1,000 people. In the time of the famine, they were overcrowded. Maybe there could be up to 3,000 people, and literally one man was controlling these people. He would have an assistant master in some of the largest workhouses, but there might be just a porter, a schoolmistress, a nurse, and, you know, possibly a clerk or a priest on site. But this guy was in charge, and most of them, if not all, ruled with a kind of an iron fist. So Portumna Workhouse was built in 1852, one of the later workhouses. The earlier workhouses, as was mentioned, they were built in the 1840s and were upstanding in the time of the famine. And it was seen then that more were needed because of the overcrowding experienced during the famine. So Portumna Workhouse was one of these plainer designs that was built. There was 30 of them built in some of the smaller towns in Ireland. Previously, the poor from the Portumna area or Porlock area would have went to Loughrea Workhouse, Ballinasloe or Scariff in County Clare, but now Portumna Workhouse opened in 1852 that was able to take in 600 people, and we have a number of, I think, 952 people entered the workhouse at the tail end of the famine in 1852. So I started in Portumna Workhouse in 2017 as a researcher, basically, and I would do some touring as well, or tour guiding. But to be honest, I found the experience quite heavy. I'm a very kind of a positive character and happy-go-lucky, and I love history. I love it, but I suppose I just found this very dark. I found it, anyone that has visited a workhouse, or maybe a mass grave from the time of the famine, or these sites that are associated with the famine and such suffering, or, you know, indeed concentration camps in Poland or elsewhere, you would feel that kind of heaviness or that kind of sadness, and that's exactly what I felt here. I had decided to leave after a week or so. I just found, given the tours, there was no way of kind of creating any sort of positive spin on the story. The one thing that did occur to me, though, was that the tours were literally about the dates and the workhouse system. Very little specifically about the people from Portumna Workhouse, because like so many, we have lost our records. Even though our workhouse stands, our records are gone. And that can be the opposite in some cases, that there are cases where the records survive, but the workhouses are gone. So Portumna is open to the public as a kind of a site. Half it is developed as a tourist destination, and for me, yeah, as I said, I was going to leave after a week. But before I left, I had one kind of private tour on my own through all the buildings, including the one we're looking at here, and that's the boys' block. And at the very end of it is the master's house, and it's still to this day known as Ogle's house. So even though he left in 1865. It's still known as Ogle's house. And as I was shadowing some tours at the start, the tour guides would mention Henry Ogle and how he disappeared. And I would ask the question of where he went to, and nobody could tell me. And I just became very intrigued with this guy. And something kind of dawned on me on that tour I had of, you know, that myself through the buildings, that possibly if I could start researching into the stories of these people, that I could possibly bring their stories to life, and possibly, as I ended up doing a publication. We've done some short films, radio documentaries, storyboards, and slowly we're bringing these people back to, we're remembering these people. So to start my research, I had to start at the beginning, and I found this newspaper clipping from 1850, and it was proposed by Mr. Eyre and seconded by Major Burke that Mr. Henry Ogle be appointed Master of the Union. Mr. Ogle was an efficient officer in Ballinasloe and a first-rate Protestant. Proposed by Mr. MacDermott and seconded by Captain MacDonagh that Mrs. Owens be appointed matron. For if the master was a first-rate Protestant, he could say for Mrs. Owens that she was a right good Catholic. And the building at the back is known locally as St. Molasses College. And something I found, the fact that Ogle was appointed and Mrs. Owens was appointed in 1850 quite strange, that they were being appointed and paid for 2 years previous to the workhouse being open. So I did a little bit of digging, and I actually found that at the back of this building we're looking at here was an old disused distillery. And this went uncovered for years, that there was actually a temporary workhouse, confirmed to me in the newspapers that there was a lease on this distillery for 2 years. So it brought us back into the famine period, that Henry Ogle had become the first master of Portumna temporary workhouse in 1850. And the numbers for that distillery, or basically a glorified shed, were up to 1,000 people. And like most distilleries, they're often close to water, and the conditions in there would be quite bad and quite damp, and sickness would prevail. So to find the Ogles, and I had one huge advantage. His name was Ogle. If his name was Kelly or Horan or something like that down in Galway, I'd have been lost straight away before I even started, but his name was Ogle. So a quick look at Griffith's valuation, which was kind of a valuation on land, or a land tax in the 1850s, but a valuable source all the same. A quick look in that, and for the Ogle family, came up with one family of Ogles living between Ballinasloe and Portumna. So I was quite excited. I said, have I actually found where they came from? Because the tradition surrounding Ogle at Portumna had said that he was an Englishman. And of course, nobody would like to admit that he was actually a Galway man just living down the road. It was easier to say that he was an Englishman, and dismiss him away as not being one of our own. But in fact, he was. And what was important then, when I went and found the baptismal records in the local church, was in 1824, Jonathan Ogle and Jane Campion gave birth to a son, Henry. I then found the house. I contacted the farmer and found the house where the Ogle family had grown up. And I stood in the house and went to visit it. And so literally I had the start of the story, where Henry Ogle was more than likely born and definitely reared. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, we have St. Matthew's Cemetery in Glan, where the family plot is, but Henry Ogle was not with them. And just a little interesting side note, there is a headstone in that graveyard for the Rourke family, spelled differently than what the Rourkes would be spelled locally, R-O-R-K-E. And one of those guys went to Africa, and a place was named after him called Rourke's Drift. So the historians online will recognize that as the site of that famous battle with the British Army and the Zulus. Just a little side snippet. I then was very lucky to find that there was still one Ogle family living in the area. That man we're looking at here beside me, that's me on the left, and in the middle there is Jimmy Ogle. So Jimmy passed away last year, unfortunately, and I suppose I'd like to dedicate this talk to Jimmy, because he was a great help and very welcoming. And I told him the story of Henry Ogle, and I was tiptoeing around the fact that his ancestor was a bit of a black sheep, and didn't seem to bother Jimmy, but Jimmy gave me lots of help. He produced his picture on the opposite side of his great-grand uncle. Now, this was a nephew of Henry Ogle, but you can almost see the resemblance between Jimmy and this guy. So we were kind of trying to build a picture of what Henry Ogle looked like, because to date I have failed to find a photograph of Henry Ogle. But I'm 5'11". Jimmy is a good 6 foot there, and he was well in his 70s. So I'm guessing that these were from kind of strong stock, as would have been suggested earlier on, that these workhouse masters were big, strong characters. So next I found that Henry Ogle had actually married Mary Jane Duffy in January 1862, and her occupation was matron of the workhouse. And that corrected some false information that we had understood to this point, that it had said that Henry Ogle was married to the matron, Mrs. Owens, who came from Ballinasloe-Witten. But of course, if we look at that more closely, Mrs. Owens was more than likely married to Mr. Owens. So Henry Ogle, Protestant, marries Mary Jane Duffy, a Catholic, in 1862. They have 3 children, all baptized in the local Catholic Church. John T was baptized in December 1862, Maria the February the 1st, 1864, and you'll see a little red line underneath where I've marked the priest name, Father Patrick Donnellan, and he'll come into play pretty soon. And Henry Jr. was born in 1865. So Ogle, a cruel master. This is a snippet from the London Illustrated Times referring to Portumna Workhouse in 1864. They say, "Such is the insight into which we are favoured into the working of the poor law of our sister country. We thought it bad enough on our own, but it seems that Whitechapel or Bethnal Green may be reckoned a paradise by comparison." Now that's a pretty damning report from the London Illustrated Times, because these 2 workhouses in Whitechapel and Bethnal Green are 2 of the most notorious workhouses in the UK. And all sorts of, terrible stories are coming from them. But they're actually saying in this snippet here, the Portumna Workhouse is the worst of all the workhouses in the UK and Ireland in 1864. And why? Well, it seems to be down to one man, this Henry Ogle, who has, after a few years, become clerk of the workhouse as well. So he has the joint role of master and clerk, in an attempt to save money by the Poor Law Union. They've made this huge mistake in giving him full control. This is a snippet from the report from the Court of Petty Sessions on the 13th of February 1854, where Ogle takes a case against William Larkin for stealing £1.16. Larkin is sentenced to be flogged and receives 1 month in Galway prison. William Larkin is 12 years old. Out of all the cases that I've come across under Henry Ogle's time, this is definitely the most poignant and the saddest of them all. It's the death of 1-year-old Patrick Hara in Portumna in November 1864. So Patrick Hara is brought to the doors of the workhouse by his mother, Mary. She's refused admission to the workhouse because she doesn't have a relieving officer's ticket. Anyone who enters the workhouse is supposed to have a ticket from the relieving officer, but she couldn't get one because it was the weekend and he was away. So she goes to the union doctor, Dr. Coates, and again, she's turned away. So she has no choice but to go back to her house or shed. She's actually living in a shed in somebody's garden. The conditions in this shed are absolutely horrendous, and the little boy dies. The coroner's report in 1864 says that the child had died for the want of the common necessities of life. When she's asked why didn't she come to the poorhouse or the workhouse earlier, Mary Hara replies, "'Tis little you know what a poorhouse is. It is the last shift for the poor to go to the workhouse." So she's basically saying if she had went to the workhouse earlier, she would have died anyway, because conditions were so bad in there. And look, they were bad all over the country, but Portumna, as is seen here, is one of the worst. Conditions are absolutely, horrendous. Mortality rate is extremely high, and she's saying it here as well. And it's one of the saddest stories of the whole period under Henry Ogle. Another tragic story is Kitty Kelly and Bridget Grimes. They both die at Portumna in January 1865. And I'm going to read a letter that was sent into the newspaper by Father Patrick Donnellan, the man that had actually baptized Henry Ogle's daughter just a couple of years previous. So it's Portumna, the 10th of January 1865. "Gentlemen, I wrote to you on the 3rd instant, informing you that 2 poor women were carted to the Portumna Workhouse on the 28th of December last, a cold and frosty day without any covering except their own clothes, and that one of them, Kitty Kelly, 70 years of age, died on the 2nd. I have now to inform you that the other poor woman, named Bridget Grimes, died between 8 and 9 o'clock a.m. today. If there was no other attention paid to this report except that what was paid to that on the third instance, I shall feel constrained in the interest of the poor to appeal to the public press for protection. To prove to you the necessity of taking notice of these two cases, I may tell you, I also remember a young girl who was carted to the Portumna Workhouse for several miles. She arrived at the poorhouse on a cold winter's night, about 9 o'clock, I think. I administered sacraments to her between 10 and 11 o'clock the same night, and she died between 1 and 2 the next morning. I remain, gentlemen, your obedient servant, Patrick Donlan, CC. So what Donlan is edging at here, and it's reported in other letters, and again there's an inquest into this, that these two women were sent for by the hospital ambulance, which was of course should have been a horse and trap. But it is said that Henry Ogle would not pay for a horse, that it was too expensive to feed. So he had a donkey and trap. So by the time that the donkey and trap got out to these women who could have been up to 10 miles away, and they never brought blankets either. He wouldn't pay for blankets to be sent out. These women literally died of exposure. And they were asked themselves why they left it so late, or when one of them was actually alive when she came in for a while, she was asked, why did she leave it so late to ask for help? And they replied that they wanted to come to the workhouse under the cover of darkness. They did not want to be seen. Again, this is relating back to the stigma surrounding the workhouse. Father Donlan created a huge stir, basically. He wasn't afraid to kind of report what was going on into the workhouse. It was making the newspapers in England, and the Liverpool Daily Post on the 26th of July 1864, it made the front page, and the headline was "The Reason Why People Are Immigrating from Ireland." And for me, one of the biggest reasons why people are immigrating from Ireland, why so many people immigrated from Ireland, was because of these workhouses too. Because what options did they have? You know, go to the workhouse or try and survive outside or be evicted. Now, of course, they needed some sort of passage to be paid for them, be it assisted passage or be it remittance from somebody who had already made it over to America. But nobody wanted to go into the workhouse, definitely by their own choice. It says that last week an investigation took place in the boardroom into a charge made by a priest as to the badness and deficiency of food supplied to the paupers. The inquiry originated in a letter published in the Munster News by Mr. O'Donnell, Reverend Mr. O'Donnell. Mr. Burke, the inspector, presided. The workhouse door was beset by a body of people, perhaps 1,000 in number, and egress and access was nearly impractical. Some miserable creatures were produced as witnesses, but it is unnecessary to record their depositions because the infamy of the system is indicated in the evidence for the defence. Mrs. Kavanagh, the head nurse, made tea for the patients, and it could not have been very difficult to make, for a gallon of water was poured on an ounce of tea. Incredible but true. When asked if she drank that tea herself, she was startled and replied, "Oh God, no." So Father Patrick Donlan, one who hates oppression. So in his initial letters, Father Patrick Donlan signed off as one who hates oppression. Eventually, everybody knew in the area who was writing these letters, so he just signed himself as Father Patrick Donlan, CC. As I mentioned earlier, he was not afraid of, blowing the whistle of what was going on in the workhouse. Now, I'm not saying Portumna Workhouse was the worst of all workhouses at that time. There was probably as many, as bad, if not worse. But a workhouse needs a whistleblower. The famous George Catch, who inspired Charles Dickens from Strand Union Workhouse, there was a whistleblower, I forget, Dr. Rogers, I think, blew the whistle on what was happening in Strand Union Workhouse. It was the same in Andover in England, Colin McDougall, that famous case in Andover, where the inmates were actually eating the kind of marrow, the rotting marrow from the bones that they were supposed to be grinding down for fertilizer. There was a whistleblower there, one of the Board of Guardian members blew the whistle into what was happening there. This stuff was going on all over the country, in the UK and Ireland, but it took somebody brave enough to blow the whistle. Donlan had grown up in the Irish famine. He had seen the horrors of it. He was from County Galway, not far from Portumna, in the Portumna Poor Law Union, and he went to join the missions. So he went to All Hallows in Drumcondra, And their motto was to go teach all nations. And just to explain, I suppose, how their life was, I have some snippets here. And it says, life was extremely difficult for these young missionary priests. In the huge spaces of North America and Australia, the priests were badly housed and badly cared for, and were forced to cope with the heat and cold of a foreign clime while traveling vast distances on horseback over dirt roads to minister to their impoverished flocks. Few of them lived long enough to reach middle age. Together with the Sisters of Mercy, they performed valiant services amongst the sick and wounded soldiers of both sides of the battlefield and in the various camps and hospitals. Father Donlan had went to Virginia, Fairfax, Virginia, and he had now got caught up in the American Civil War. His church was St. Mary's Church, and it says here was one of those repurposed churches operated as a hospital or field hospital, and it was described by his bishop, Bishop McGill. He says, the floors and walls of St. Mary's Church, Fredericksburg, were literally besplattered with the blood of the wounded and dying soldiers brought there for hospital treatment. So not only had Father Donlan lived through the famine as a young man and seen the horrors, as I mentioned, he's now in Virginia in the heart of the American Civil War. He's watching his church, being turned into this field hospital. He's sent back then, probably for his own safety or by request, we're not sure, to Portumna, and he takes up the role of CC and he makes his way into the workhouse. And he has no fear. He's possibly traumatized from what he's seen, but he definitely has no fear in taking on the likes of Henry Ogle or the Board of Guardians and reporting into the newspapers of what he's seeing. So eventually, I've only covered a few, but there was numerous inquests and inquiries. Ogle keeps getting away with a slap on the knuckles. I'm convinced that he had strong connections locally in the kind of hierarchy. I did find after I printed my book that he was actually a Freemason, which again would kind of cement that theory, because he was never really pulled in for what he had done. But all this pressure literally took its toll on him. This is a timeline up to the point where he actually absconds, because the master of Portumna Workhouse famously absconded in June 1865. On May the 17th, the board met to discuss dissolving the union. So it's possible that Portumna Workhouse Union or Portumna Union, Poor Law Union, could have been dissolved. Then all the books would have to be shown and closed. So it strongly suggested that Henry Ogle was fiddling the books and probably had been doing it for the time that he had, the 8 years that he had been both clerk and workhouse master, that he was skimming, that he was supposed to be buying in proper quality food. He wasn't. He was buying in this blue moldy food that was literally being skipped and dumped before the Poor Law commissioners could see it. The hospital, these are some of the conditions that Father Donlan talks about. The hospital had a high mortality rate because he reckons the beds were in dirty, wet conditions. They were cold, filthy and damp. The food was dreadful. The bread was hard and mouldy. Kitty Madden told him that her invalid daughter could not eat the food, and they would leave the workhouse and try and survive on the outside on berries alone. Henry Ogle had actually dumped a cartload of blue molded bread before the commissioners could see it. John Howard, another inmate, told Father Donlan that he was so thirsty that he resorted to drinking his own urine. When asked why Howard was left the workhouse with no shirt on his back, Henry Ogle replied, well, he did not enter with one. The paupers were also regularly placed in solitary confinement, strategically placed beside the unemptied cesspools where the stench was overbearing. So every little thing that Henry Ogle could do to save money and possibly put money away, he was doing. But this was at the cost of the paupers and sometimes to their lives. For example, when he turned away little Patrick Harrod because he wouldn't let him in, he wouldn't feed him, because literally, if he was skimming the money, he was seeing this extra money that would be taken from him if he was feeding more paupers. On the 3rd of June, Ogle and the board met to receive and consider tenders to build an infirmary kitchen. And again, the tenders would have to be brought in kind of sealed envelopes from the local builders. Oftentimes they would be, accompanied by, in inverted commas, a brown envelope or maybe some cash to ensure that they would get the job. So that was the last act Ogle had before he absconded. Now, a very interesting thing happened here. We see on June the 4th, David Breen, the Ballinasloe Workhouse Master, is arrested for murder. I have a snippet here from the newspaper which says the arrest of the master and schoolmistress of Ballinasloe. The master, David Breen, and Miss Dunn, the schoolmistress, have been arrested about 3 hours ago for the murder of the infant found in the retiring room or toilet on Wednesday last. It appears that on the night of Thursday, the day after the last inquest was held, the master revealed to his wife that he carried out an illicit intercourse with Miss Dunn, and the said result of her becoming pregnant by him. So don't forget that Henry Ogle was the former assistant master of Ballinasloe Workhouse. He was literally from that area. Whether there was any connection between Ogle and David Breen, I'm not sure, but certainly the Poor Law Commissioners would have been down like a ton of bricks on this. There would have been police, everything. There would have been a huge kind of an incident surrounding Ballinasloe Workhouse. So Henry Ogle, for some reason, be it a combination of all these things, absconds from Portumna Workhouse on the 8th of June, 1865. This is the famous newspaper clipping. That's all we had. That this is all we were aware of what had happened to him. And it says the mysterious disappearance of the master of Portumna Workhouse. Mr. Henry Ogle, for many years the clerk of the union and master of the workhouse of Portumna, has absconded in a most mysterious manner. On Thursday morning last, he took a car at the hotel and drove to Birr, where he discharged the car and nothing more was heard of him till Saturday, on which date his wife, who is the matron of the house, received a letter bearing the Liverpool postmark, telling her to go and reside with her father till she would hear from him. All sorts of conjecture and gossip are afloat respecting the absent man, but one thing appears to be agreed on by all, that money matters have nothing to do with his flight. His accounts are said to be in a most satisfactory state, and it is understood that he has left a large sum in the bank and in railway shares, and a half-year's salary for himself and his wife is still in the hands of the guardian. While it is said in that newspaper statement that the accounts are in order, not so long after that point, it is said in another newspaper clipping that the workhouse accounts are in a most unsettled state. Another newspaper runs with the line that the master of Portumna Workhouse has taken French leave. But other than this, there's almost a silence, almost an eerie silence about Henry Ogle. What has happened? There's one new little clip to say that his wife was suspended from her role, but then taken back on when they're happy that she had nothing to do with his departure. And it seems that Henry Ogle has actually left the workhouse high and dry. The accounts are literally cleared out, and he has left his wife with 3 small children to look after, and he's abandoned her. So where did Henry Ogle go? So for me, this was the biggest part of the story. If we could just find where he left. So the first thing I went back to was that newspaper clipping to see was there a clue in there. And there was a big clue in there, of course. It said the Liverpool postmark. Now, Henry Ogle was obviously a clever individual. He wasn't going to stay in Liverpool. If he did, the police would have picked him up pretty much straight away. So by the time he had posted this letter, I presumed that he was on his way. Obviously, Liverpool is a major shipping town, city. So where do you go in 1865 if you got money in your pocket and you want to get away? So of course we guessed America. If you're going to America, we guessed New York or Boston. New York was the first guess. So a quick search on Ancestry, and we got the shipping records and found a week after Henry Ogle left the Portumna Workhouse, there was a Henry Ogle, age 35, the same age, on a boat called the City of Manchester. His occupation, in inverted commas, a shoemaker. Could this possibly be our Henry Ogle? I strongly believe it was. As a researcher, sometimes you get a hunch that you're on the right track, and I was pretty much convinced it was. So Henry Ogle, had he escaped to New York City? So what I needed to do then was check the census and stuff in New York. But before I did that, we found out that Henry's wife, Mary Jane, had also entered through Castle Gardens on January the 1st, 1866. There's nothing in the newspapers about this either. So this seems to have been pre-arranged. Obviously, he was true to his word. He had wrote a letter back to his wife, and she makes her way over to New York. Interestingly, when we see the shipping record, there's a Peter Dervin Witter, there's an Anne Duffy Witter, don't forget her maiden name is Duffy, and there appears to be a woman in the middle as well, Bridget Conway. These are all Galway names. It appears that she's gone over with 3, if not 4 other people as well, and one of these guys appears on the later census. Now, just to follow the timeline, in 1866, in July, Father Patrick Donnellan passes away. He's made his way back to Virginia. I think he possibly was sent from Portumna because he caused such a stink. He made his way back to Virginia, and it's reported in the Fredericksburg Ledger that they regret to say that the overpowering intensity of the heat, Father Patrick Donnellan, the priest in charge of the Catholic Church in this place, has fallen victim. Basically, Father Donnellan was on a boat called the Vanderbilt, as we see it there on the left-hand side, and he was making his way from one parish to another when he succumbed to literally heat exhaustion, and he was only 36 years old. It was actually harder to find Patrick Donnellan and where he came from and where he ended up than Henry Ogle, believe it or not. But we finally found his headstone in Virginia. And this is a project that we're working on with the Order of Ancient Hibernians, I think, in Virginia, who we're hoping to get the stone resurrected in his memory, because undoubtedly Father Patrick Donnellan has saved many lives in Portumna Workhouse with his intervention. So in the 1870 census, we find Henry Ogle is now living in Lower Manhattan, possibly the poor side of Manhattan in a large Irish area. He's working as a clerk in store. His wife is there, Mary Jane, keeper of the house. The 3 children are there. And on the bottom, we have Edward Dervin, as I mentioned, who came on the boat with Mary Jane. And he's also working as a clerk in store. So it appears that Henry is doing what he loves best. And again, he's handling cash. The 1880 census, then we also find Henry Ogle, and we find Mary, and we find John, but Henry Jr. is missing from this one, and that kind of raised my eyebrow on that one. So we'll deal with it in a couple of minutes. At this stage, Henry Ogle has moved further up into Midtown Manhattan. He's living in one of these brownstone houses. For us, I suppose, growing up, we maybe recognized one of these houses in a show like The Cosby Show. I didn't notice until I made my way to New York. You know, this was the kind of the rich part of New York. And Henry Ogle had literally made his way up from Lower East Side Manhattan, right all the way up into the center of town. Excuse me. So at this stage, in around this time, Henry Ogle becomes a tenement rent collector. A little quote here about these tenements that were literally full of Irish people, Italians, but there was a huge amount of Irish. It says here in How the Other Half Lives by Jacob A. Rees. It says that disease was rampant in the tenements. Tenant houses were nests of fever, infection, and the poisoned abodes of physical decay. And in 1865, a report questioned that the entire tenement house population was devastated by the domestic petulances and infectious epidemics that arise from overcrowding and uncleanliness. And I feel that led to Henry Ogle's downfall, as we'll find out. Now, in 1877, Henry Ogle and Mary Jane lose their child, Henry. Remember, I mentioned in previous slides that he was missing from the 1880 census. So we started researching. A friend of mine, Diane Russo-Karpozowicz in America, helped me out with a lot of the stuff in New York City where I couldn't get to. And she found this death record for young Henry, who had passed away at the age of 12. So even though the Ogles were moving up into Midtown Manhattan and he was working away and probably comfortable dealing in a cash job again, we could say they were living the American dream, but then their fortunes start to turn, and they lose their child, Henry. We lose the Ogles then. In history, the sources go dry. We can't find them. There's, I think, the 1890 census, if I'm not wrong were destroyed in New York, but we lost them and there was nothing, there was no trail. The paper trail went dry. So we thought that was the end of the story, until purely by chance I came across a newspaper, a clipping from the New York Times in 1906 that reports a funeral of a Mary Jane Ogle, who's widow of Henry Ogle. And basically what happens here is there's a funeral worker strike in May 1906. These guys called the Kavanaghs, obviously Irish undertakers, break the picket and basically decide that they're going to, work the funeral. So it gives the address of where they're living, where the Ogles are living, and they talk about bringing the coffin to St. Agnes's Church on 45th Street in New York. So when this happens, there's almost a riot with the picketing funeral workers. So the people in New York, it's kind of rush hour at the time, they realize what's happening and they actually come out and protect the funeral cortege. And that's why it enters into the newspaper as an extraordinary funeral. But what it does for us is it gives us an address where they were living in 1906. It gives us the church where the funeral was held. Don't forget, Mary Jane was a Catholic. But crucially, it says that Mrs. Ogle, the body of Mrs. Ogle, was sent to Woodlawn Cemetery over the New York Central Railway. When the body leaves the church, the people outside, up to 1,000 people, follow the cortege and protect it from the picketers and see her off on the train. But most importantly for us, it points us to Woodlawn Cemetery. Now, Henry Ogle was a Protestant, she was a Catholic, were they buried together? And this for me was very exciting. Had we actually found Henry Ogle after all these years? So I rang my friend Diane, I think it was January 2000 and possibly 18 when this happened. There was maybe 2 foot of snow in New York at the time, so she couldn't make it to Woodlawn, and eventually she did. So I made it over to New York myself in 2018. I met Diane, and I'm forever grateful to her because we literally had a whistle-stop tour of New York City. I had recording equipment with me because there was a radio documentary funded by Galway Bay FM by Sally Ann Barrett, produced it, and I was recording it as I went, and we had a wonderful time kind of chasing ghosts around New York City. Basically, we went to St. Agnes's Church to do some recording and just to see the place where this remarkable funeral took place, and only for it we wouldn't have completed our story. I entered inside and there was mass on, and it was in Latin actually, and I just stood at the back of the church and recorded the Latin mass, and the hymns actually added greatly to the documentary, and I just got a feel and tried to imagine what this was like the time of her funeral. What caught my eye was a baptismal font in the corner as well, and another little side snippet. It said at this baptismal font, the Irish patriot Eamon de Valera was baptized on December 3rd, 1882, another snippet. So we made our way to Woodlawn Cemetery to see could we finally catch up with the notorious workhouse master Henry Ogle and finish our story. And here I have Diane standing beside a grave slab. She had actually found the headstone for me and sent back a video to us in Portumna. And there was great excitement that day in the workhouse when I opened this video, and we waited for all the staff to come in. And it was quite strange, a quite strange feeling being there. I had found him. I had found his wife. Mary Jane was buried with him. Henry had died on April 9th, 1896, aged 65 years old. And for me, this was the end of the story, and quite a fitting end that we had actually, found where he came from and found, where he ended up. And if you see the little grave slab, you'll see a tiny little red arrow I've pointed there, a little stone. When I went to his grave site, I wanted to bring something from Portumna. Not to be disrespectful either, but I brought a small little stone from the solitary confinement in Portumna Workhouse from the girls' yard, and I just placed it beside the slab as just a little memento to say that Portumna Workhouse had finally caught up with Henry Ogle. But that was not the end of the story. There we have another look at the headstone. Henry Ogle died April 9th, 1896, and Mary Jane died May 8th, 1906. What was remarkable was when we found, again, thanks to Diane, we found the death records of Henry Ogle. He's mistakenly called Andrew in one part, but then it confirms he's Henry on the other part. He's 65 years old, he's white, he's married, he's a collector as occupation, he's from Ireland, 32 years in New York City. Jonathan is his father and Jane is his mother, and it gives his address, and it says he dies from acute dysentery and senile dementia. So quite a rough end. If we're familiar with those diseases, that they're quite rough. And I mentioned that possibly working in the tenements was his downfall. Possibly he picked up dysentery working in the tenements, because it would have been rampant in the tenements at those times. And they say that in the research I've done, that chronic dysentery can actually bring on dementia. So it's possibly this is what was his downfall. But it says his place of death was Manhattan State Hospital on Ward's Island. So just to get a kind of a photograph, I suppose, of where he died and can maybe finish the story there, I just Googled the hospital and it came up with this, that it was the New York Asylum for the Insane. So Henry Ogle had actually died in an asylum for the insane on Ward's Island in New York. To get an idea of what conditions were like in one of these asylums, I bought a book called 10 Days in a Madhouse by Nellie Bly. And this is when a few coincidences started kind of coming through. This was a very strange story. It literally unfolded right in front of me. Nellie Bly is literally buried, a couple of meters from Henry Ogle. She was a journalist, an investigative journalist, and she tricked her way into one of these asylums in around the time Henry Ogle died. On Ward's Island. There was one for the women, I think, on Randall's Island, close by. She tricked her way in. She had no problem pretending she was crazy, and she wrote an account about her 10 days in a madhouse. The problem was she was sane, and when she wanted to leave, she couldn't convince them that she was sane. And she struggled to get out, and she did obviously get out. And she writes about a lot of people who were actually in there, and Irish girls that were actually, might have just got in trouble or might have just got drunk, but were actually perfectly sane but could not get out of this asylum. Now, she mentioned the conditions in the asylum, and I'm just going to read out some of them if I can find them here. No, they're on my slide, sorry. The following are some of the accounts given by Nellie Bly. On bathing day, the tub is filled with water and the patients are washed one after another without change of water. This is done until the water is thick and then is allowed to run out and the tub is refilled without being washed. The patients who are not able to take care of themselves get into beastly conditions and the nurses never look after them, but order some of the patients to do so. After breaking a window, I was transferred to the lodge, the worst place on the island. It is dreadfully dirty in there and the stench is awful. In the summer, the flies swarm the place. The food is worse than we get in other wards, and we are given 10 plates. When we got into the dining room, at least we found a bowl of cold tea, a slice of buttered bread, and a saucer of oat milk with molasses on it for each patient. I was hungry, but the food would not go down. The bread was hard in places, and in places nothing more than dry dough. I found a spider in my slice, so I did not eat it. I tried the molasses, the oatmeal and molasses, but it was wretched. I can't read the rest of the line there, but you can see what I'm getting at here. These are literally almost like, they're pretty much the same words as what Father Patrick Donlan was reporting from the workhouse in the time of Henry Ogle. These conditions would have been quite similar to the conditions that Henry Ogle died in on Ward's Island. So literally, I suppose the word karma comes to mind if people believe in that, but the whole thing had done the full circle. It is still, Ward's Island still is a psychiatric hospital. I couldn't take a photograph of it, but this is a photograph I just took of the barrier that separates people from the outside world, and it kind of symbolizes just what these institutions are like even nowadays. So the Ogle story comes to an end in New York City. Henry Ogle had died, an awful death, really, in a mental asylum. Mary Jane had died in 1906 and had an extraordinary funeral. Young Henry had died in 1877, aged 12 years old. Maria had got married, but the marriage broke down and she had no children. And then John Thomas, who also became a worker, he was an inspector in the tenements. He married twice and had 3, if not 4 children, and all those children died in infancy. So the Ogle story came to an end eventually in New York City. So just a quote from Galatians 6:7, whatever a man soweth, that he shall also reap. Now, if you've enjoyed this story and you want to hear more, there is a link here on the Galway Bay FM website. I have the links here, and it's basically a radio documentary that was done on this, and it's a 2-hour, 2 parts, 1 hour in each part, done by Sally Ann Barrett, and it was shortlisted for an IMRO, basically the National Radio Awards in 2020. And it just, if anybody is interested in hearing more of the story, you will find it there. And I just want to say thank you very much, and that's the end.
Thank you very much, David. That link for the podcast, I'll have that sent out via email also, so people will be able to listen to it. Certainly I'll listen to it. I think it'll be very interesting. Someone actually asked David, had Ogle any connections in Armagh? Now, I don't know if you can go back that far, but it wouldn't be a common surname, so you never know, you know.
Yeah,
Ogle wouldn't be common at all. It's
not common at all. And I had a very friendly gentleman down from the north of Ireland. He was a minister for a tour, I think last year, and he informed me that the name Ogle, you know, and I was aware that there was a town in the north of England called Ogle, but he reckons that there were border reivers, that there were raiders, that they would raid into Scotland and stuff. So there were a kind of notorious clan of I won't say villains, but there were tough cookies. Now there's a Brendan Ogle, I think, that has, you know, been I think he's involved in the unions and that kind of thing in the Republic. But I have made no connection so far to the north of Ireland. But it is strongly suggested that the Ogles arrived in County Galway in Aughrim. And we'll be familiar with the Battle of Aughrim that came after the Battle of the Boyne, and that as payment to some of the soldiers that they actually received land. Maybe some of the higher ranking soldiers actually received land in that particular area, and that the Ogle family were one of them. That's possibly where they came over with the Williamites back in the 1690s.
Because just someone mentioned there are Ogles buried in Lurgan, Shankill Cemetery in Lurgan. So. And that would be a very old graveyard. So there could be connections there going back. Just mentioning too, there were some comments that for people listening, the workhouse in Bonboy is Bawnboy in County Cavan. Yeah, it's well preserved and a good example of a scale of what a workhouse would have been like. And there is also a Famine museum in Donaghmore, County Laois. So Donaghmore would be DONAGHMORE museum.ie, which would also be very informative for people. Just looking at my notes.
Just on that note, Bonboy is an exact replica of Portumna Workhouse.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, because they were one of the later workhouses. So some of our buildings that are missing, sometimes we refer to Bonboy for photographs. I don't think Bonboy is open to the public at the moment. Donaghmore is probably, and there's an agricultural museum there as well in Laois, in the one in Donaghmore. And we'll be open ourselves from the 1st of March this year, if anybody wants to come down for a trip.
There's the question, was there any link with Mount Bellew Workhouse and specifically Dennis Kelly, landlord who was a Board of Governors there and from Ballygar, County Galway? Does that sound at all familiar to you?
I wouldn't be familiar. I'm familiar with Mount Bellew and I'm familiar with Ballygar. I'm not familiar with Dennis Kelly. Even though I was in Ballygar only last week at a funeral of a lady called Kelly. But I know there is on Facebook a Mount Bellew Workhouse project. There is a good society there in Mount Bellew, so I'm sure they'd have the records. Now there's also in Galway, the Galway County Council website, they have some of the records for some of the workhouses as well in County Galway. So definitely whoever has that query, they should start Googling and they should be able to get some information there.
We just discovered too there are Ogles in Donaghcloney, which is in our
Okay,
also in our council area. So maybe
very good. They won't be happy with me
maybe
when they hear what I've been
maybe this
saying.
is Ogle country up here, you know.
Maybe.
So I'm just running through the questions here. Sorry, have I missed? There's a lot of comments that people have enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much, David. A fascinating story. Someone's saying here, I worked in Portumna for a couple of years in the 90s, and at the time the workhouse history was never mentioned. This is from John, who's in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get the message up. Apologies, just bear with me everyone for a moment. I'm trying to just read this. This is just disappearing on me. But the workhouse history is never mentioned. But why was Portumna picked as a location for a workhouse given its small size? I would imagine though going back, this is going back to kind of famine times, that we have to remember the population on the island was very dense.
Mm. Oh, well, what was wrong was the people in Portumna area and surrounding area that eventually came to Portumna Poor Law Union. They were going to workhouses in Lorrha and Ballinasloe, which were overflowing. So you know, and that was happening in some of the bigger workhouses. So there was a need for smaller workhouses then in smaller towns like Portumna. And don't forget, when it opened in 1852. There was more than 300 people, you know, it was overcrowded by 300 people. So there was a necessity for it at that particular time. And again, because of the famine.
There aren't any other questions that I can see.
Okay.
But David, thank you very much. Certainly, I think everybody would, a lot of us will listen to the podcast, and I'll certainly send out that link.
Okay.
And hopefully, your talk tonight about Mr. Ogle will kind of maybe spur a little bit more interest into the other, maybe kind of the people that were behind in the background of these facilities.
Okay, I suppose I'll just finish on that. As I said, as you mentioned earlier on, I've studied public history in UL. And public history is just making history a little bit more accessible to kind of everybody. So, you know, reading history in an academic book mightn't be everybody's cup of tea. So, indeed, what we're doing here tonight is public history, you know, bringing it to people and making it more accessible to people across the seas, and making it a little bit more interesting to children as well, and the new generations that are coming behind us, that you know, history can be also learned in film form and podcasts and all sorts of different things. So so thank you very much for all your nice comments, and again, thanks for having me.
And David, just before you go, just before we finish, I want to mention that Fergus here mentioned that there's a contrasting story of a workhouse master is John Farrell, master of Sligo Workhouse, 1852 to 1866.
Yes.
And I suppose that again would be an interesting read for people.
I think that was printed by the Four Courts Press, or was it one of the Minute series? I think, and maybe it was one or the other. Anyway, it should be available online.
Okay. No, thank you very much, David.